terms of access, we've done very well since 1994. And actually, if you look back to the late 1970s, we had a massive expansion of schooling, which continued up to about 1995. So the fact that now we have around 98% of learners between the ages of 7 and 15 enrolled in schools. And some study done by UNESCO a few years ago showed that in terms of secondary school expansion, South Africa experienced one of the greatest, one of the fastest in the world. In terms of institutional restructuring, remember too that in the apartheid years we had 19 education departments in this country, and the 1+9, which was the central ministry plus the 9 provincial departments which we had to constitute after 1994, has effectively taken place quite smoothly. We have to be very careful when we look at the Eastern Cape, because they had to actually amalgamate 5 or 6 different education departments, and without having the capacity to do that particularly well. Resource equalisation, we spend, as you will be aware, a lot of money on education in this country. That it's 20% of government spending. And now, about 40% of learners, over 5 million, are in no-fee schools. And we have a national school feeding scheme as well, which is very effective. But on the negative side, curriculum reform, and I do not want to get sidetracked by this, but with hindsight and Jonathon the Elder, as I like to call him, Jonathon Jansen, was the lone voice in the 1990s about the disastrous impact OBE would have on us. But we've lived through that. Where we failed too is building the technical core. We do not have really, I think, in the state, a meritocracy, and the system of patronage, I think, has quite a devastating effect, particularly in education. So, where it all comes down to is, in terms of quality, that the South African education system, as I'm sure you're aware, is of a very low level. Okay, that it's a whole trade-off between access and quality. And in fact, we're kind of losing out on this. In fact, we've kind of traded off, I would suggest, access for quality. Not that our politicians, as you saw who that is, doesn't appreciate that in fact, on the playing field of life, there is nothing more important than the quality of education, but it seems to me to be a case of quantity everywhere, but not much by way of a quality drop to drink. So, measuring up to failure. Now this is quite startling. We participate in something called the SACMEC 3 study. It's a consortium of Southern African and East African countries, 14 of them from Uganda downwards. And if you look at the proportion of enumerate and illiterate students in Mozambique, where the average spend on education is around 600 rand per kids, it's very clear that in fact we have a real problem. In South Africa, we spend nearly 15 times as much on education, and our innumeracy and illiteracy rates are higher. Now that is the question I suspect you want me to try and answer tonight. Why is it that we spend so much money on education, yet we have such low returns? But those figures are astounding. I mean, they are seriously astounding, aren't they? And what makes it even worse is that, and there's a young economist at Stellenbosch University, Nicholas Spohr, who I must acknowledge, did a presentation on SACMEC 3 recently. And he was facing an audience of educators, and he was saying, he's young and fiery, and he was saying, just please explain to me what is going on here. How is it that we can spend so much on education with so little returns? Well, the fact of the matter is we have a system, a bimodal education system. And the way I'm going to illustrate this further is by looking at what happens in the trick. And that's just one ex-Model C school in the southern suburbs, and there will be some of you who went to it. And I'm not going to give it away, but it's near the end of the alphabet. And there, the pass rate was 100%, 168 rode, 167 got B degrees, so you go to that school, you pass, you get a B degree, access to university. And compare it with the 19 Kai literature schools, where, let it be said, last year, performance was a lot better than it had been in the previous year. If this had been this time last year, I would have put up a more dramatic slide which showed that the Kai literature schools were performing lower than the Eastern Cape. And that's in our backyard. But the 19 Kai literature schools last year, 64% pass rate of the 2,800 who wrote, and 431 B degrees, which at 15–16% is not bad by national standards. But when you look at the number of subject distinctions, go to the ex-Model C school, you will get, that was a Freudian slip. I went there, my children did too. Is that, on average, 3 distinctions each, compared with, on average, 3 per school in Kailicha. Now that is frightening, but this gets a little worse. But if you look at an indicator subject like physical science, the average at that X Model C school is close to 80%. And that's not because the exam got any easier, but what's happening in the X Model Cs, and this again is another topic for discussion, is they've learned to game the new system as well as they did the old. And the problem we've got is that if you look at Kailicha, there were 2 distinctions in physical science. So that's this extreme bimentality of performance. But hang on, wait a minute. All the research everywhere in the world tells us that there's a strong correlation between poverty and educational achievement. And I know what you're thinking there, but hang on, how does that explain the difference between us and Mozambique? But this is true too. Schools can't equalize vast income gaps, and they can't reinvent our social order. That's just not going to happen. In front of me all the time, I have this, and forgive me for Desmond Tutu, I admire immensely, this image of us as a rainbow nation, which might have been very important at a certain time, I find is fading fast. What did we imagine schools could do? Because they haven't done it anywhere else in the world. And we just have to accept that there is such a thing as middle class advantage versus working class disadvantage. Middle class schools start school with an advantage already locked in. They have access to better health care, better nutrition, better educated parents, more books at home, whereas children in poverty have poor nutrition, poor housing, and economic instability. So, in saying this, I'm suggesting that we've just got to accept that poverty is a fact. I'm not suggesting it's an excuse. So, if I could just pause, and I am on halfway, which given all these disruptions is a bit surprising. Can I just read something from Alice in Wonderland? Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That depends a great deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. So long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if you only walk long enough. I think we really are facing quite a problem. Where do we go? Where do we go from here in education in this country? And I'm going to try and answer some suggestions about that now. Our challenge then, and we know what our challenge is. We've got to improve the quality of schooling which poor children receive. But the question we ask ourselves, why are we struggling to make any headway? And I'd suggest that we could reduce this down, rather simplistically, to the following. That actually we've just got to accept that this is the collateral damage of apartheid education in a mass-based system, which is not going to go away. Put together what I suggested a bit earlier, that if you look back on how there was a massive expansion of schooling at the time of high political contestation. At the same time, we were having to train tens of thousands of teachers who themselves had had a poor quality Bantu education, and they were being trained in hastily erected and mostly rural teacher training colleges. Those people are in the system today. And I think what we have to accept too, we've got these residues of political contestation in the system, and we saw a little bit of that in the Eastern Cape at the beginning of this year, and that's a complex picture in the Eastern Cape. But there actually, the attempt by the Education Department to withdraw the contracts of temporary teachers was an attempt to make some sense of what had become an increasingly distorted post-allocation to a number of schools. What happened was the majority teacher union, who I have one or two careful things to say about just now, was able to take a whole lot of teachers out on strike, and in fact, the union won. But I'm going to suggest this too, and this is with no disrespect to equal education and their civic partners who argue for minimum norms and standards in schooling. And in fact, physical resources might be a limiting factor. There shouldn't be any more schools. Every school should have a library and have a functioning science laboratory. But I would suggest that it's not the major issue, because this is a school in Kailicha which has more computers than the X-Model C school I mentioned earlier. Twice as many computers as the X-Model C school. However, if you look beneath the tables, that's what you find. And that, to me, is part of a puzzlement which, to anyone coming from outside the system, is difficult to process, difficult to make sense of. And I would suggest that perhaps part of the problem in this country is we've got enough resources to throw at education, but we don't know what to do with it. And what we've got then is a deeply ingrained culture of inefficiency in producing learner achievement. And that, I would suggest, goes back to the 1980s. And then you have to imagine what it's like to be in a community of schools where no one knows how to be other than the way they are. So there is no experience of reproducing schooling anything other than what you have experienced yourself. And then I would suggest that human capacity constraints, i.e. the kind of poor quality of teaching, which coupled with limited organizational management expertise is at the root of our problem. Is that teachers do not have, and I'm not doing anything other than stating what others have said many times before me, teachers have shortfalls in content knowledge, in pedagogic skills, in curriculum and organizational management skills. But I would like to suggest too that if you gave me the choice of teaching at that ex-model C school, running that school, and running a large township school, a piece of cake would be that middle-class school in the southern suburbs. To run large, and many of the township schools are over 1,200 learners, to run large schools with limited human capacity, with a myriad of socioeconomic problems of the community around you, takes one hell of a lot of organizational expertise. And we mustn't forget that. We must be careful about being too judgmental. But I would suggest too that the key dilemma is one of accountability versus support. And the state struggles to deliver, and in turn struggles to hold all teachers to account. And I would argue that the ongoing authority crisis is the thing which marks us as unique in this country. And I would argue that there is no other country in the world which has a similar set of toxic circumstances, to use Graham Bloch's expression in a way. This authority crisis, let me repeat, marks us as unique. And what do we need to do then? We have to re-establish political authority over schooling. The state has to do that. Teachers and principals, right, hold them to account. But the state too has to be held to account, because teachers, given their backgrounds, given their experiences of schooling, cannot be anything other than the way they are without significant levels of support. So this accountability and support issue, I think, is a critical thing we need to resolve. Right. But that's politics. And as an ex-teacher, we're pragmatic. I'm pragmatic. What can we actually do? Well, we have to build the state's organizational and logistic capacity. And that's lacking at the moment. And there was a picture, I think, in the City Press or Sunday Times this weekend of a whole lot of textbooks lined up in a storeroom waiting to be delivered. We can actually afford textbooks. I have this notion of my years of experience in Kailicha. If you dug into the sands of that township, you would find the rotted remains of tens of thousands of textbooks which have been provided over the years. I ran a Dinaledi school, and every year I used to get another 200 HP calculators. We didn't know what to do with the stuff we were being given. And we have to invest heavily in anti-poverty programs. We know they work. Prenatal and early childhood education programs. But actually, at the core of all this, we have to find a way of rejuvenating the teaching profession. Is there a silver bullet? Well, you know the answer. No, there isn't. But we do know what to do. We have to focus on learning. We have to get schools and teachers in those schools to focus on learning. We have to build organizational coherence because we have to maximize instruction. There was a large study done looking at schools on either side of the border fence between Botswana and Northwest Province, and they found that Botswana teachers were spending significantly more amounts of time in the classroom than our teachers are doing. We have to use assessment for its purposes, and the way we're going at the moment with our ANA tests and in the province are 3, 6 and 9 tests, but not using it for diagnostic purposes. We have to have high-functioning curriculum support networks. And perhaps most critically of all, we have to have parental and broader community involvement in our schools. But I would suggest that everything is underpinned. Everything has to be underpinned, whether we like it or not, whether we want to throw half the teachers into the sea. We can't do that. We have to have intensive and sustained professional learning. And we haven't done that up to now. Up to now, probably about 40% of all corporate spend, and the many billions, has gone into infrastructure, has gone into building more and more computer laboratories, building the Madiba schools which sit on the hillsides and rot in the Transkei. Now, in closing, that is the first class of matriculants I ever taught back in 1984 in a village school called Mchaupe in a small place called Makapanstad north of Hammanskraal north of Pretoria. And I have what is now a very faded photograph, which I keep on making photocopies of on my desk. And there's a face there, which I wish to show you, which is that kid. And I have no idea what her name is anymore. I don't know who she is. But if you can imagine, she's sitting where you are, and I was one of those teachers sitting on a stage. And she was looking up with such willingness to learn in her eyes. And I would suggest that of the 4 ingredients for a successful and effective schooling system, we have got 2 of them. We have young South Africans who did and still do now want to learn, actually. We have a curriculum, the power of having a centralized curriculum, something the Americans don't have. But what we don't have is we don't have an effective teaching corps. And perhaps most critically of all, we don't have a community that values education. So, in closing, with 4 seconds to go, there's a quote from Dinah Rabbit. She's a very interesting American scholar because she's turned completely full circle. She was one of George Bush's education advisors. And she now admits she was wrong. She says now that the charter schools are a selling off of the American schooling system. She says that the No Child Left Behind program is proving disastrous for poorer inner city schools in America. She says poor children can learn and excel, but the odds are against them. Reformers like to say that demography is not destiny, but you know what? Saying so doesn't make it true. Therein lies our challenge. Thank you for listening.